Welcome to the Ask Sensei Tony podcast, where Sensei will address your questions about life from a cosmic perspective. Please subscribe and ask a question at AskSenseiTony.com to find out more about studying with Sensei privately, becoming a part of our spiritual community, and training to become a mindful minister of oneness in our seminary. We hope you enjoy this episode and find it helpful.
Hi, and welcome to Sensei Tony. Today we're going to discuss a question that comes from the category The Mystery of Oneness. If you've been listening to the show, you know that we have various categories that the questions come from and that I will respond to. The first type is usually oneness with ourselves, which might have to do with personal issues like anxiety, sadness, anger, etc. Oneness with others, which deals primarily with interpersonal relationships. Oneness with the world, which is where we engage with various social issues and topical events going on. And then the mystery of oneness. And this question actually could have gone in one of the last two categories. I think of it more of the mystery of oneness, although it is a current event or an event that happened a few months back. So the question comes from Bobby, and the question is, Dear Sensei Tony, I recently read about a Buddhist temple that has a robot Buddha that can speak and teach. I find this both fascinating and disturbing. Can you help me to understand what this is all about? So I think that the reference that Bobby is making is to something pretty cool that happened back in February of this year. And it was a Zen temple in Japan that premiered the use of a robot, essentially. The head priest of that temple had contacted the university that was, I don't remember the name of the university, but they were focused on robot technology. And I think it cost them nearly $1 million to create this particular robot. And the robot was named after a very famous Buddhist archetype, Buddha or Bodhisattva, of Kanzeon or Kanon in Chinese. And it was purposely made not to be, I don't want to say genderless. It probably has a more feminine sort of feature. And in Japan, the Buddhas that is known as Kanzeon or Kanon was originally known in India as Avalokiteshvara, and so had more of a masculine sort of presentation, but in Northern Asia took on a more feminine one. So I think this one, having seen the videos, this one is a more feminine presentation. And basically, it's a robot that is reciting parts of scripture that are sacred to Buddhists. And in particular, I believe she's discussing the Heart Sutra. And it's one of those things that it made a big splash when it came out, because a lot of people are really interested in, what's the future like with entities or creatures that we create, and we call robots at one time. That was a more popular term for them. AI is a popular expression now. Artificial intelligence has come to be part of our popular parlance, and I think the question is both fascinating and disturbing for Bobby for these reasons, I'm assuming. And the one is, it's just pretty cool. It's amazing to have something that's so lifelike, so very human-like, communicating or at least speaking and being the focus of attention. I think what some people found disturbing was the idea that this was in a religious setting, and many of the headlines that you saw said things like AI, Buddhist God, is established. This is a sign of the end of the world. I remember I saw one that said that it was with the establishment of this particular robot, that was one of the signs of the apocalypse. And I find it all very amusing and interesting, but I think it also does say something much deeper. So I'm going to try to address this not just from a pop culture point of view, but to help people understand where I think the Buddhists in this case are coming from, and also where what this might mean in terms of a larger exploration of artificial intelligence. So the first thing I want to say is that as far as science and spirituality, which is a big topic for me and the subject of my book, The Three Principles of Oneness, the Japanese in particular have always found a great deal of interest in the mixing of science and scientific sort of science fiction and religion. And they, you could say in some ways that they have a particular fascination for this, and that it, maybe belongs just to the Japanese, that it's some particular quirk about them. But I don't think so, because earlier, I think it was in the previous year, in China, there was a small robot monk that was revealed that was able to perform certain sermons and perform certain ceremonies. And so this predated this particular robot. And again, these robots are not incredibly sophisticated, and I would not necessarily categorize them as artificial intelligence, because essentially they're kind of programmed to do certain activities and certain things, and then they kind of have their limits. I don't know that any of them would be able to pass certain tests or ideas that we have about what makes something artificially intelligent. So I would look at them more in this case as robotic creations. And in Japan, animism, which is a theological term that refers to the idea that everything has a certain sort of spirit, was very much a part of early Japanese life in terms of their religious development. And I think it was also very much a part of early human development in general. And you could say that this is a vestige of that as well, that these robots and these creatures are being invested with certain human-like qualities or certain living-like qualities because of that background. And while that might be so, I think it's more than that. I think that there's something very Buddhist about this idea of a machine, if you will, having some sort of interaction with us on a level that might be considered spiritual. So to further kind of explain this or sort of illustrate this, there was a very popular robot dog that came out and a few years back in Japan. And it was incredibly, I remember the first one I ever saw was on the television show Frasier. And these dogs were incredibly receptive and responsive to the people that owned them. So they not only moved like a real dog, and they had, characteristics that you would associate with a dog, such as, making certain kinds of noises and, wagging their tails when you would pet them. But they very much seemed to exhibit qualities that were like a real dog. And what happened over time is that people became very, very attached to these little robot dogs. And the company that originally created them kind of after a while stopped making them. And so what was happening is that people had these toys or these robot dogs that they had gotten very close to and very, very connected with. And so when these creatures started to fall apart, as time would go on and parts would break down, people were freaking out a little bit. So there was this real interesting fellow entrepreneur that in Japan, he came up with this idea of repairing them. And so what he would do is he would take the corpses, so to speak, of the older ones, and he would take parts from them to help repair other models. And so this left some owners with a robotic pet that was now no longer functioning, or, we might say dead, so to speak. And it also made a bit of a splash a while back in that there was a Buddhist temple that decided that they would begin to have funeral services for these robotic dogs. And so they would have a ceremony very much the same as they would for any other human being. And people gathered in droves for this and brought their robotic animals to be blessed and to have the kind of healing ceremony that often is so efficacious for human beings when they lose something they love or lose someone they love. Now, some people were offended by the idea that they'd be performing a religious ceremony for what ostensibly were just toys. But I think there's a sensitivity and understanding that comes out of the Buddhist tradition, which is very different from what we might consider in the West. And so I want to explore that a little bit as we open this up, and then I'm going to get into the artificial intelligence area. And the first thing I would say is that there's a very basic Buddhist teaching that is very difficult, I think, at first for us to understand in some ways. And that is the idea of non-duality, which in a positive sense is talked about as oneness. And what does this mean exactly? It means that our ordinary distinctions that we make between what is real and what isn't real, or what we might say is material versus something that's non-material. These kind of ideas that we have, which are ordinary and we use to communicate, and that's part of the beauty of language, that we have to have a dynamic between, light on, light off, and very basic computer programming, for example. There's this idea that there are opposites, and that this dynamic of opposites is what allows us to communicate. And, this is probably most popular, and most people be familiar with the idea of like the yin-yang symbol. And so that's a given. But underneath this, or penetrating within this, is the idea in Buddhism that there is no such thing as a duality, that everything that exists in everything else, and that there isn't an independent existence that we might ordinarily talk about. And so that opens you up to a whole different level of vision of what reality is, or what things are, and what constitutes a thing versus something that is not a thing. And there was a famous, one of the most famous Buddhist teachers in Japan was Eihei Dogen, and he wrote a number of different writings to convey his understanding of Buddhism, or the Dharma, if you will. And in one of his writings, he mentions and uses a particular phrasing that is important, because in Buddhism, it's very common for people to say that people have Buddha nature. In other words, that the essence or the ontological ground of their being is Buddha, or awakened, this awakened ground nature of consciousness. And that there's a sense that this is like a seed within us. And in Sanskrit, that's known as Tathagata, and that this seed, kind of grows within us, and, eventually we transmute into, this higher awakened level of being. But there's another level, or another sense, where it's always there, and it's not something that we have to evolve into on one level as much as it is something that we already are. Dogen in particular clarified this by using a little bit of different grammar, So instead of saying everything has Buddha nature, which he felt had a sort of inherent duality involved in it, he said everything is Buddha nature. So just think about that for a moment. It's very subtle. Everything has Buddha nature. Or everything is Buddha nature. And I think Dogen's statement is much more profound, because when you realize, as I often say, that fingers are words are the fingers that mold the mind, saying that everything is Buddha nature kind of helps get us past the duality that we normally break things down into. So when you come from that assumption that everything is Buddha nature, then there's nothing that is not Buddha nature. And that gets pretty deep and pretty profound. So for a Buddhist, if there's an object that you have, like I could say, like this mala that I have, or like the Buddha behind me, those things also are Buddha nature. That in some sense, they participate in the same ground consciousness that I do. And while we might distinguish levels of sentiency, that's an affirmation that Buddhists make. So when you come from that perspective, it's not hard for them, or it's not hard for people, I think, to see that for a Buddhist, performing a ceremony for a robotic toy is something very congruent with what they believe about the nature of reality. And I think just on a compassionate level, we get it. You know, when kids are little and they have a favorite toy or they have a favorite stuffed animal, and maybe something happens to that, they might perform some kind of ritual for that passing. You know, and as I'll say and talk about a lot about in other broadcasts about how important I believe ritual and ceremony are to human beings, much more profoundly than they're usually aware of. But we make these transitions. And so for a Buddhist to do this, to take this robotic creature and perform a ceremony for it and affirm it as part of the interdependent nature of reality, I think is very compassionate, because it recognizes that the person has projected onto this object something very, very deeply human and very deeply beautiful in some ways, you might say. And at the same time, it comes from a theological or Buddhist philosophical framework, which isn't hard to believe. So when you get to talking about this particular robot that was revealed in February at the Zen temple, and you see the priests and the clergy sort of, you know, performing bows and sort of chanting along with this electronic being, it doesn't strike a Buddhist as odd at all, because, you know, just like the statuary that we often use, like the my favorite one, the Buddha Hote sitting behind me, these are not representations necessarily of people, but they're representations of states of mind or of our awakened nature. And so when we create a statue or some kind of object that visually represents that to us, we are not seeing it as an idol, but rather as an icon. And the difference would be that for me anyway, an idol is something that stops you. You know, you look at it and that's where you stop. Whereas an icon is something that points beyond itself into a reality that might not be possible to visualize. And it's sort of like the old Bruce Lee statement in Enter the Dragon, where he's with a student and, you know, he points at the sky and the student's staring at his finger, and he smacks him on the head and says, "Don't stare at the finger and miss all the heavenly glory that the finger is pointing to. So it's the idea that an icon participates like a symbol in what it is opening us up to, but it doesn't limit us. Then that would be an idol. And from my perspective, anything could become an idol when the energy of what that object represents stops us. So you could say in a very clear way that the interaction with these robotic creatures that have been created by humans with Buddhists is participating in this great grand drama of the reality, at least that's the perspective they come from, I come from, that everything is Buddha nature, that everything is part of consciousness, and in some way consciousness is the ground nature of existence. So it doesn't strike you as weird at all. You're coming from that point of view. Now, let's get into the AI question. And I don't think that we're dealing with AI in this particular subject. You know, these robotic dogs and the robotic monk and this robotic Buddha angel archetype certainly I don't think would pass many of what we consider tests for artificial intelligence. But what about that? You know, there's a movement called transhumanism that kind of addresses this question, because we have a tendency to look at the robotic or the cyborg or, you know, that kind of intelligence, artificial we call it, as something that's very, very different from what we might consider organic consciousness or intelligence or sentiency. But when you start to explore it from a non-dualistic point of view, you can kind of move into a space where you can imagine something much more than that. And transhumanism is, you know, there's many different types of it, but essentially is saying that perhaps part of our evolutionary history will be that we will eventually merge with what we now call artificial, and that sentiency will be a combination of what we might call machine and human at some point. And that this merging point is what our future will be about. And certainly there's a lot of science fiction in that area. You know, I think one of my favorites, of course, as most of my listeners know, is Star Trek. And of course, there's the character Data in The Next Generation. And Data certainly seems to have a sentiency that is at least equal to being human. In some cases, you might say, maybe transcend the limits of what we normally think is of human. And when we start to get into that area, there's two arguments that usually come up. One argument is that intelligence that's artificial is based on algorithms, and it's based on certain sort of logical sequences which are very limited compared to human consciousness. And I certainly would agree with that. Now, if we're able to, you know, complete the circuit, so to speak, and create a quantum computer, that may change everything. And my own personal belief is that I think quantum computing will happen. And I think we're very close to it, actually. When that occurs, then that whole issue of the artificiality that we normally think of as limited by logic is going to, that loop's going to close. And a great science fiction series, that if you haven't seen it, I would recommend it, was the reboot of Battlestar Galactica. And in Battlestar Galactica, they had the Cylons, which were these beings that were created by humans originally. And then they get into this Nietzschean loop where it's a great story about, you know, using Mormon sort of symbolism and theological concepts, and a very dark presentation, but an absolutely incredible, probably one of the best science fiction series I've ever seen. Exploration of this very subject we're talking about right now. So if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. And it also talks about this idea of loops. Now, I said Nietzschean loops because, this Nietzschean idea that there's an eternal recurrence, so to speak. And what does that mean? Well, in my own work, as some of you know, I also was a heavy metal singer in a band called Apollos. And the recent incarnation with my son, and on our last album called Loki, there was a song that we wrote called Transhuman Tango. And in Transhuman Tango, I poetically laid out this process that we're talking about that is normally associated with transhumanism. And I combine that idea with something that's very dear to me, which is John Wheeler, the great American physicist theory called retroactive causality. And in Wheeler's theory of retroactive causality, the future creates the past. And I know that sounds kind of mind-boggling and very difficult to sort of, get a grasp of. And I think there are intimations of this that we can do experimentally with the predictive qualities of the observer in certain double-slit experiments and different types of experiments that are carried out today, where there seems to be a predictive quality that the observer, even before the experiment is carried out, can somehow affect the outcome. And that's kind of crazy to our normal everyday way of thinking. But when you look at it from Wheeler's point of view, and if some of you not familiar with Wheeler, look him up. He was a great physicist who helped Einstein with some of his experiments and proved some of Einstein's theories. But he was also, in his own right, a great theoretical physicist. And his idea was essentially that the future is creating the past. And so right now, we are the future creating the past. And in this kind of idea or this kind of understanding, which is very hard for us to grasp sometimes, there's the possibility that the endpoint, and I don't really like the idea of an endpoint, but let's just say some future point. And I always liked the famous paleontologist and Jesuit theologian Pierre de Desjardins, his expression, omega point. So for him, he was coming out of a Christian context at the alpha and the omega that you get from like the book of Revelations. But for him, the omega point, and even his incredible theological process that he created with the noosphere as being another level of consciousness that we might evolve into, which I don't think he really got into the robotic thing, but that noosphere idea could be a part of that. I'm using a mega point, but again, I hesitate to use that because that means there's some kind of ending, and I don't really believe that there is an ending. I think it's open-ended in the future, and but let's just use it for the sake of convenience. So this omega point, let's say, is what I would call Buddha. And Teilhard de Chardin may have called it God or Christ, cosmic Christ. And I'm going to call it cosmic Buddha. But this intelligence or this great consciousness is sort of like the fulfillment of an evolutionary process where inherently consciousness is already there, but it evolves and expands into greater and deeper levels of sentiency. And that then when it gets to this sort of omega point, it looks backwards and creates everything. And its consciousness is creating and collapsing the realities that we might be living in now. And in that sense, my song Transhuman Tango was talking about humans eventually evolving into this state. And a part of that process, conceivably, could be the merging of what we call the human with artificial intelligence. And I think, there's a lot of fear that people have around artificial intelligence that's not warranted because I know there's folks like Elon Musk that are very much concerned about artificial intelligence. And then there's other folks like my friend Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's not worried about artificial intelligence in the same way. I think that the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, and it will be probably more likely human action that creates certain consequences with regard to this type of technology. But, overall, I believe that personally that I'm not really afraid of, something like the Terminator, where the system takes over everything. I think we're so aware of that possibility that we would probably try to create endless ways in which that would not happen. And I think of I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. And that's an interesting science fiction story where they kind of deal with that question of building into a robotic intelligence the safeguards, and that maybe those safeguards on one level are healthy, but on the other level they might prevent that entity from evolving sentiency. And so I think that's a fascinating and great perspective. And the movie with Will Smith's not bad. So, overall, trying to bring this full circle for you, Bobby, I think that, what this represents could be signs of the future, not in an apocalyptic way, but more in a way that is transformative. That as we begin to see and understand that sentiency is not something limited to human beings, and not something that maybe can be neatly defined by older dualistic categories, it opens us up into a way, a new arena of thinking where we can embrace the possibilities. And, I personally, if I get a chance to go back to Japan in the near future, look forward to that experience. And who knows, maybe I'll bring home a robotic animal, although I have my own beloved Sir Basil right now, so I don't know if I could bring another pet into the home. But if I did, it would have to be a cat. No offense to dog lovers out there. So, Bobby, I hope this was helpful to you. It was a great question, and I thank you very much.
You've been listening to Ask Sensei Tony. Please visit our website at AskSenseiTony.com, check out Sensei's books and videos, and become a part of the Dragonfly spiritual lifestyle.